Good evening and welcome to the 14th session of the Faith and Science Fundamentals webinar series. Last week we talked about geology, and today we will get an introduction into the world of paleontology, an exciting topic that will accompany us until the end of the series. What do fossils tell us? Fossils are fascinating objects that have been found since ancient times, and as many of them look like animals that have turned into a stone, they used to be associated with magical processes. But at the end of the 18th century, the French naturalist Georges Cuvier began to study fossils scientifically, and since then, they have been of great importance in the debate about origins. So it may be interesting to find out what fossils can tell us about this topic. If you do a search in Google Images of the phrase fossils, evidence for, you will find two completely different types of pages. It seems that for some people, the fossils are clear evidence of the biblical flood, while for others, they are irrefutable evidence of evolution. And once again, we have come across something that I mentioned to you in the first sessions of this webinar series, and that I also told you that we would repeat frequently: the importance of distinguishing between data and interpretation. In this case, the data are fossils, but what they tell us, the interpretation, seems to be not to be unanimous. During today's session, I'm going to make a special effort to clearly separate the two concepts, and this way we can practice. I will let you know when what I'm explaining is data and when it's interpretation. Sometimes the difference is very clear, but other times it's more subtle. So as an exercise, I will challenge you to be very attentive because throughout the talk, I will ask you, like the first day, data or interpretation? If you've done the homework and have seen the videos that are recommended from Dr. Nalin and Dr. Esperante, many of the things that we're going to explain will already sound familiar to you. Let's start with some basic definitions and concepts. What is a fossil? Fossils are remains of organisms that live in the past or evidence of their activity that are preserved in rocks. The best known fossils are parts of animals, usually hard parts such as bones, teeth, or shells, that have been lithified. In other words, they have been turned into stone. But in reality, the concept of a fossil is much broader, and there are a great variety of fossils. In addition to the animals or plants preserved in rocks, there are others that are frozen in the ice of the North Pole, or that fell into tar pits. There are also insects and even small vertebrates that are preserved in amber, which is resin or sap from ancient trees that solidified with the animal inside. Although rare, in some cases, soft tissues such as skin or even internal organs of some animals have become fossilized. In all these cases in which the fossil is the organism itself or some of its parts, we're talking about body fossils. But there are also what is called ichnofossils or trace fossils. In this case, we don't find the animal, but rather clues that it was there, such as footprints, burrows, and even coprolites, which are fossilized excrements. How does a fossil form? How does an animal or a plant turn into stone? Just as there are different types of fossils, there are different fossilization processes, but we're only going to explain the most common one in a simplified way. An animal that fossilizes doesn't just magically turn to stone. No, that's not what happens. What happens is that its components, the organic molecules that make up living things, which we talked about in the biology module, are replaced by mineral material while maintaining the shape of the organism. Fossilization is not easy. Most living things that live and die on Earth do not fossilize. They decompose and disappear. For an organism to become fossilized, certain conditions must be met. First, a quick burial to prevent the dead animal from being eaten by scavengers or destroyed by environmental agents. Second, the organic material has to be replaced by mineral material. Typically, these two processes have something in common: water. Water currents that carry sediment can bury dead animals, at the bottom of lakes or seas. Then that same current circulating around through the body can deposit dissolved minerals in the water and facilitate the fossilization process. Where are fossils found? Last week we said that fossils are almost always found in sedimentary rocks. If you think about it, it makes sense. For a fossil to form, a quick burial is required. This burial usually occurs when sediment that is carried by a current of water covers a dead animal or a plant that is at the bottom of the sea or a river. When more layers are deposited on top and the sediment compacts and cements into a sedimentary rock, the fossil is inside. There are lots of fossils. There's fossils all around the world. So you just need to have a trained eye to be able to see them. I'm actually going to show you some fossils that my husband and I found this last fall, just a few kilometers away from our house. We had gone out, we hadn't gone out to look for fossils specifically, but we went out to look for mushrooms, and we found, just by casual, without even realizing it, a fossil. We started looking and we realized that almost the whole mountain was covered with these Ammonites. You can see that the rock or the fossil here, if you look closely, you can see spirals or lines, which is typical to the shells of the Ammonites. And maybe you can see it a little bit farther away. Here's another one that I had from before. Here's a third one. You can I'm not sure if you can see the spiral with the camera here, but... So, when you guys go out for a walk or a hike, keep your eyes open because you may find something while you're out there. How long does it take for a fossil to form? There's a popular belief that fossils take millions of years to form, but that's not true. It's not even possible. So when an animal dies, even when buried, most of the body rots within days or weeks. Some bones can last for years. But if the fossilization process took millions of years to occur, there would be nothing left to fossilize. Paleontologists have done experiments to reproduce the process of fossilization in the lab and have concluded that some fossils can be formed very quickly, in just a few hours, and that most fossils form within a few days or a few years. The rate of fossilization depends on many factors, such as the size and type of organisms, the amount of dissolved minerals in the water, the type of sediment, and so on. Two other very important concepts to understand what fossils tell us are the geologic column and the fossil record. Last week, we talked about some layers of sedimentary rocks that extended as far as to occupy hundreds or thousands of square kilometers. Well, geologists have analyzed sedimentary rocks from different parts of the world, and they found that many of them match. I want to say that they are made up of the same types of materials and deposited in the same types of environments. So they've come to the conclusion that they were deposited more or less at the same time in different places around the world. Although not all the layers are found everywhere, by comparing the sequences of different places, geologists have been ordering the layers and placing them one on top of the other until they form what we know as the geologic column. The geologic column is an artificial construction that includes the main layers of rock from all around the world, arranged from the deepest to the most superficial. In addition to putting them into order, geologists have separated them into blocks and named them. The lower part of the geologic column is called Precambrian, and the rest is called Phanerozoic. The Phanerozoic block is divided into three parts: the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic, and each one has its layers and its sublayers, with their respective names. And there are some very famous ones like the Jurassic, which I'm sure sounds familiar to you. So here goes the first question. You can answer them in the chat. Is the geologic column a fact or an interpretation? I'll give you a few seconds to think and then answer. Is the geologic column a fact or an interpretation? Very good. I see a lot of answers coming up. Great. Most of you answered correctly. It's an interpretation. There is no place in the world where the complete geologic column is found. It's a composition that geologists have made from data collected from different places. But it is a weighty interpretation that both creationists and evolutionary geologists accept as valid. What is the fossil record? Well, it turns out that many layers of the geologic column have fossils, and each layer has a specific set of fossils that differentiates it from the others. We call the set of layers with their respective fossils a fossil record. Now that the basic concepts are clear, we're going to describe the main characteristics of the fossil record, trying to differentiate between data and interpretation. As we just explained, the fossils are not all mixed up or randomly placed in the geologic column. The first characteristic of the fossil record that we are going to comment on is that the fossils are in order. Each layer has its own fossils, and when we look at the whole picture, we see a series of general patterns regarding the order. For example, the fossils of animals that appear in the deepest layers are marine invertebrates, and as we go up, more land animals start to appear. If you look at the vertebrate animals, they appear in a precise order. First, fish are at the bottom, then amphibians, then reptiles, then mammals, and birds are on the top. Human remains are only found in the upper layers. We also observe that there are many animals and plants that don't exist today in the lower layers. Then, as we go up the geologic column, more familiar organisms appear. In the uppermost layers, most of the fossils are of present-day living organisms or are very similar ones. Okay, let's keep on going with the questions. What I have just told you, are they data or interpretation? Everything that I just told you about the order of the geologic column. Are they data or interpretation? Very, very good. Perfect. Although everything that has to do with fossils actually contains some interpretation because when someone finds a fossil, they have to classify it, I've tried to describe the fossil record in an objective way by simply saying what each layer contains. So we could say that it has to do with data. Now, what does the order of the fossil record mean? The conventional interpretation is that the fossil record is a reflection of the history of life on Earth that spans over billions of years, and that each layer contains information from a different era. The oldest eras are the deepest layers, and as we move up the column, we move closer to the present. According to this approach, this interpretation, each layer contains the remains of the living things that inhabited the Earth at that time. And the order of the fossils represents how organisms have evolved over time. This history of millions of years and different collectives of fauna and flora inhabiting the Earth at different times does not agree with the biblical account. But it is important to remember that it's an interpretation, and there may be other ways of interpreting the same data that do agree. We'll look at that in just a minute, but we're going to continue describing the fossil record right now. Another important characteristic is the drastic changes in the fossil content that occur in some places in the geologic column. We've already said that the different layers contain different types of fossils, but there are some places where the change from one layer to the one just above is spectacular, both in number and types of fossils. For example, in the deepest layer, the Precambrian, there are hardly any fossils, and those that exist are very small. However, in the layer immediately above, the Cambrian, we find thousands of different fossils of marine animals of many types that are also very complex, such as trilobites. The trilobites are an extinct group. They don't exist today, but we know a lot about them because we have found thousands of very well-preserved fossils. Their body was divided into 3 parts, with an external hard exoskeleton and jointed legs like insects and crustaceans. In many fossil trilobites, it's been observed that they had compound eyes like those of modern insects. The difference in fossils from Precambrian to Cambrian is so great that geologists call it the Cambrian Explosion, referring to an explosion of life in which thousands of organisms suddenly appear in one layer that are not found in the layer below. In addition to the border between the Precambrian and the Cambrian, there are 5 places in the fossil record where a drastic change is observed between the fossils of 2 contiguous layers. In all cases, there is a change of more than 75% of species from one layer to the other. Whole groups that were in the layer below are no longer in the layer above, and new fossils appear. In many geographical representations of the fossil record, these drastic changes in flora and fauna are called mass extinctions. Is this a fact or an interpretation? What do you think? Would you call these drastic changes of flora and fauna the mass extinctions? Is this fact or interpretation? It looks like we're getting answers from both, but we're hedging more towards interpretation. So indeed, this is an interpretation that makes sense within the conventional framework of millions of years. It is understood that when a drastic change occurs, it's because something happened that killed many of the beings that inhabited the Earth at the time, and later new organisms appeared or evolved that filled the gaps. The most known of these mass extinctions is the one that supposedly wiped out the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. There is a characteristic of the fossil record that is related to this, and that we could consider data. In many parts of the world, we find fossil deposits that paleontologists call mass mortality, because we find hundreds or thousands of dead and fossilized organisms in the same place. These Ammonites are like the ones that I showed you earlier, although you can see these better. The same as the ones in the mountain near my house. These Ammonites show us what mass mortality would be like. Sometimes they are organisms of the same type, these mass mortalities, as in the Dinosaur National Monument in Colorado in the United States, where thousands of dinosaur bones have been found. But in other places, such as in the Green River Formation of Utah, there are mixed animals of different types, such as fish, birds, and turtles. So, in this case, they're so well preserved that in many of them you can see what the soft tissues were, such as the meat or the skin. We can also consider coal mines evidence of mass mortality, which have been formed from thousands of tons of plant material, as well as oil fields, which are also remains of millions of living beings from the past. The last characteristic of the fossil record that we're going to comment on is that most fossils are recognizable and easy to assign to a certain group. For example, any zoologist with a little bit of experience would recognize that this is a bat. And we can all clearly see that this is a fish, that this is a dragonfly, and that this is a turtle. Although many fossils correspond to organisms that do not exist today, they are still relatively easy to identify and classify in a specific group, such as dinosaurs or trilobites. Well, that's the most general pattern. But it's true that there are a few organisms that are different or difficult to classify because they have characteristics of two different groups. A well-known example is the Archaeopteryx, which has typical reptile teeth, a long tail, and claws, but it also has typical bird wings and feathers. These types of fossils are called intermediate fossils, or mosaic fossils. Which of the two names do you think is better if we try to stay in the descriptive fields of data without going into interpretations? If we don't want to make it interpretation or enter into interpretations, which of the two would you believe is more data oriented? The intermediate fossils or mosaic fossils? You can answer now in the chat. We have really fast people here. You're answering so quickly. Very good. Exactly. The word intermediate suggests a process. It suggests that this animal is a link in evolution between the two groups. But the word mosaic is more aseptic. It simply means that we find different parts in one organism. It's important to pay attention to these things because sometimes our vocabulary betrays us without us realizing it. With all the information that we have so far, with the data that we have found in the fossil record, we're going to try to listen and understand what fossils tell us about origins. We're not going to pretend that we're completely objective and that we don't have any preconceptions. I personally believe that the Bible tells the truth about the origins of life on Earth, and therefore I approach the fossil record trying to find evidence that is consistent with biblical history. But since I also want to be an honest scientist, what I'm not going to do is try to force the data to match what I think. If there's something that doesn't fit, you already know my strategy. There it is. Keep trusting the Bible, keep investigating, and be patient. So let's see here. According to the theory of evolution, all living things have a common ancestor, a very simple aquatic organism similar to a bacteria, which became more complex and diversified very slowly over millions of years. However, according to the Bible, God created a great diversity of complex animals from the beginning. And sometime later, a catastrophic flood killed many of them. When I look at the fossil record with my biblical worldview glasses, I see a lot of evidence that fits the biblical account. The first one. The fossil record does not show a progressive increase in complexity and diversity, but an explosion of life from the beginning, from the base. In the Cambrian era, there are many different types of animals whose anatomy and physiology are just as complex as today. The compound eyes of Trilobites were made up of many independent eyes, and this implies that they had a highly developed nervous system, capable of collecting information from many independent eyes and constructing a single image. The second, the fossil record shows a lot of evidence of water and catastrophe. The very process of fossilization requires rapid burial and water. So it makes sense that a large number of fossils could form during the flood. Also, the mass mortality deposits, where hundreds or thousands of remains accumulate, the gigantic coal mines and oil deposits that are distributed around the world also fit well with the flood. The third one, according to the theory of evolution, evolutionary changes are slow and progressive, so the fossil record should be full of intermediate organisms. But that's not what happens. The vast majority of fossils are easily classified into separate groups, which fits the idea of God creating different animals and plants from scratch, with some adaptability, but that cannot turn into something entirely different. But as I've told you before, we must be honest and recognize that some of the data in the fossil record does seem to match the theory of evolution quite well. For example, we have the order of the fossils. We said that at the base of the geologic column, we find marine invertebrates, and that as we climb through the layers, fish appear, then amphibians, later reptiles, and finally birds and mammals. That is the exact order that the theory of evolution proposes for the progressive appearance of animals. What do we do when we come across a situation like this, where the data seems to contradict the biblical record? A very important thing is to recognize the problem and not ignore or deny the data. In the past, some creationists denied the validity of the geologic column, saying that was an evolutionist invention. But that's not true. The fossils are there, and they're in that order. What do we do then? Well, what we always do, keep trusting the Bible and keep investigating. We look for alternative hypotheses, another explanation for the data that is compatible with the biblical account and that can be studied experimentally. This problem of the order of fossils is quite old, so creationist paleontologists have been thinking about it for a while. And the best known alternative theory is the so-called Ecological Zonation, which proposes that the layers of the fossil record do not correspond to different times, but to different ecosystems. As the flood waters rose, they would destroy ecosystems and drag their inhabitants to the seabed, forming successive layers. In this context, it makes sense that what we find at the bottom are marine invertebrates because they are the animals that live at the bottom of the sea. Later, the fish will be buried and then the terrestrial animals. This theory doesn't explain all the details of the fossil order, but there could be other factors involved. Other possibilities that creationist researchers have investigated are, for example, the buoyancy of carcasses of the different types of animals. Experiments have been done by putting dead animals in pools and observing how long it takes for them to rot and fall to the bottom. Interestingly, the first to sink are the fish, then the amphibians, and then the reptiles. Mammals and birds are the ones that float the longest. Another factor that could influence the order is the behavior of the different animals. Birds and mammals, and of course people, are more intelligent and have a greater capacity for movement, more than other animals. So during the first phases of the flood, they could have been able to flee to the higher areas, which would cause them to be buried later. More research is needed, but these are some of the factors that may have played a role, and the results have been experimentally shown to coincide with what would be expected in a flood and with what is observed in the fossil record. Another problem that we have to deal with is the intermediate fossils. We've already said that they are rare in the fossil record, but they do exist, and we have to give them a plausible explanation in the biblical context. Also, in the case of the Archaeopteryx, there have been creationist researchers who have claimed that it was a fraud, that it was a mixture of bones from two different overlapping organisms. But researchers have since shown that it was a real animal. And furthermore, several more species of feathered reptiles have been found, more specifically in deposits found in China. What is the alternative hypothesis? If these animals are not intermediate stages of the evolutionary process between reptiles and birds, what are they? How do they fit into the framework of biblical creation? The simplest hypothesis is that they were animals created by God that went extinct, like many others, such as dinosaurs and trilobites. The fossil record shows that the biological diversity was greater in the past, that there were many animals and plants that don't exist today. And God is not limited to our biological classifications. In reality, many current animals don't fit well in these classifications either. But as we're used to seeing them, we don't give it any importance. Mammals are animals with 4 legs, hair, mammary glands, and that give birth to live offspring, right? Well, dolphins don't have hair or legs. Bats have wings. And platypus have duckbills, poisonous glands, and they lay eggs. If we didn't know these animals and we found their fossils, we would probably have the same doubts as the ones that we have with the Archaeopteryx. But that an animal has a mixture of characteristics does not mean that it's the connection between two evolutionary groups. It's simply an animal with a peculiar physiology and anatomy that is perfectly adapted to its environment. Personally, the platypus has always struck me as a proof of God's great sense of humor. It's as if he were telling us, do you like to have everything controlled, well organized and classified? Well, classify this. Let's see how that goes. Jokes aside, I think that there is a lot of evidence in the fossil record that matches well with the biblical account of creation and the flood. And I have summarized it for you here in this slide. But there's also some problematic data which we are still investigating. Well, our time is up. If you still want to know more information about what the fossils tell us about origins, I would recommend that you watch the documentary of the Geoscience Research Institute, The Tale of a Trilobite. It's a little old, but it's very interesting and it explores very deeply into more of the topics that we started talking about today. For example, the complexity of the eyes of trilobites and the intermediate fossils. I've added the link to the document, the Google document with all of the additional material. In the last 2 sessions of the Faith and Science Fundamentals webinar series, we will continue to explore the wonderful world of fossils, and we will discover more evidence in favor of the biblical account, but also some enigmas that are still to be solved. Next week's topic fascinates children and moves large amounts of money in Hollywood, but we will try to approach it from a scientific perspective. Dinosaurs.